Okay, hi, I'm back, and without further ado, my name is Beth, and I am currently reading my dad's manuscripts. I'm doing it so because basically when you hear things being said, it's a whole entire different thing than trying to read it. So you can really catch a lot of problematic language, and it's just another way of being able to edit things properly. So I'm doing that. Also, I'm doing it so I can practice speaking in front of people. I know that speaking to one camera may not be the same as actually speaking to hundreds of people, and not really have that kind of problem. I just want to be able to read things without doing I'm still going to be doing that, but that just is the way it goes. Anyway, this is one of many manuscripts I've already written. Read. This one is a little bit of a different one. It's also fantasy for the most part. The novel I'm reading right now is called Plague Wizards, and I'm on chapter 3. Hajloni tapped on the workroom door and opened it. Matungal marked the place in his scroll with a block of polished stone. So Haji, my boy, you've got the authorization to force me to put all our necks in a noose and hope that the worst won't happen? No, it's not just that you're that easy to read. I have friends passing me a bit of gossip from time to time. Hajloni's face was grim. Ha! Pray the worst won't happen. We've been doing that for years. The worst, Melungtal, is that some power-mad fool decides to be the Blue Blossom Wizard come again. And now we have a chance to see it doesn't happen. And you keep dithering around, wanting to make the soup taste just a bit better. Oh? Melunctal was not argumentative. Is that what you think I've been doing? Just adding bits and flourishes? It isn't as simple as all that. And I did try to explain it to you, Hajji. Yes, you gave me your explanation as to how there was still some danger in putting this project into operation. But I think the matter is simple and straightforward, though you protest it is not. Yes, you gave me your explanation as to how there was still some danger putting this production into operation. But I think the matter is simple and straightforward. Whoops. Though you protest it not. It is not. I'm going to have to remove you from the project. According to rules, every step of your progress has to be recorded, so that any competent wizard can take it on and complete it. So, you're not really needed here, are you? I see. Going to lock me up in a deep, dark dungeon, are you, Haji? No, I don't think you're a criminal, just a bit misguided. You're to stay in your suite, under guard, until the project is put in place. If you don't cause any trouble, you can be quite comfortable. I see. You'll have an escort for me, will you, Haji? Certainly you're not going to trust me to report to my rooms like an obedient student sent for chastisement. Hajloni didn't allow himself to be baited. He opened the door and signaled to the 5 soldiers who stood outside, all clad in breastplate, greaves, and helmet, each with a short spear in hand. Escort the scholar to his suite, and hold him there. Remember, he is not a criminal, and not to be mistreated. Off you go. Yes, sir! Melunctil said nothing and was merely marched off quietly. What can you tell us of the colony farms, Farrell? Projections on profits, and so on. Royan looked down at the table nervously, at the nervously twitching Farrell. Their status is good enough, sir. If we were to take all their profits, it could ease our own situation considerably. I really think, though, that at least some of the profits ought to be put back into the colonies. We can certainly use the profits immediately, but if we forego them, we can stretch our budget just a bit farther into the future. The fact that Farrell had actually expressed a recommendation caught Royan sufficiently by surprise that his answer did not come immediately. Fine, we'll go with your proposal. Before Farrell could spoil the moment for himself by expressing doubts, Royan turned to Ormond. Have we any masters? Even potential masters? Ha! Ormond's big hands lay palm down on the table. We have 11 youngsters, most of whom I wouldn't ordinarily trust to wash dishes in the kitchen, let alone do any sort of complicated working. I've been dropping them a bit, though, having them read everything available, particularly stuff just a bit above their level. Next week I plan to have them start actual practice. The purple flower, I think. Royan nodded. The purple flower? Hardly a test of power, is it? You think we really want tests of power just yet? This is a test of following procedures. I see. What about the baby wizards? Ormond grinned, just a bit nastily. Altered the writing lessons to mostly reading and copying simple spells, rather than old histories and poems. Might just speed their actual magic training a little. See that they're written hard on actual comprehension. If a kid gets a wrong notion in his head early, it may be hard to train out later on. You just keep fending off the king and all, and leave me to running the teaching. Royan nodded. Speaking of fending off the king, I'll have to let you handle that, Ormond. I'm leaving for a week, possibly 10 days. There's another matter that needs taking care of. What? Ormond was angry. Farrell looked his usual uncertain self, but more so. It's about the Ascension gift. I really don't know what Tangrel intended, but there's a young woman from outside sitting out in a farm village. She's part of the Ascension gift somehow. Not that she is the gift, but Tangrel was planning on using her somehow. I've got to go see if I can find out what. He looked around the table. We all know how the king is. A good Ascension gift could go a far way towards pulling Pangua House back into his favor. Ormond, anything that really needs the Grand Master's approval, put it off until I'm available. Make emergency decisions as you have to. It's only the Ascension gift, and the prospects of the household, Royan thought to himself. Love at first sight was one of those things that happened in the old stories. Usually to two people for whom it would cause the maximum social or political difficulty. In real life, one's family chose one's mate, and the two learned to get along well, sometimes even extremely well. In his own case, he was an orphan, adopted into Pangua House, and so far as there had been no talk of him marrying anyone, he had a fair idea of his own abilities, and he that sometime, in the next few years, tentative offers ought to be coming to his seniors. He caught himself. He was the senior. Yes, that was something he was still having trouble accepting. It would be up to him to accept or reject, and possibly up to him to choose a wife. He shook his head. Not for a year or two yet. They had to get Pangua House out of this mess before then he could consider possibilities of marriage. There's something about this dark-haired woman, though. He pulled his mind back to the task at hand. He had worked out the position of the village and its distance from Gagapang. He might have even ridden a duca, but pushing one of those long-legged riding beasts on to the utmost would require a week and a half of riding, and then a week and a half back, no more, because the woman would hardly be used to riding a duca, and they wouldn't be able to push the pace. On the other hand, there was one project he'd been working at for several weeks before Tangrel's disaster. The project was fully ready and only needed testing. He smiled. Yes, a 4-day trip out and another 4 days back again would constitute extreme testing. He couldn't guarantee that it was altogether safe, but then, there was danger everywhere. He had started with the observation that hot air rose. Why could not that power be harnessed to lift and carry things? Possibly even to carry things over long distances. It had not been quite so simple in practice. First of all, an enormous amount of hot air was needed to lift the smallest thing. Then he had developed spells to augment the lifting ability of the hot air. It had also been necessary to produce a bag that could hold sufficient hot air to be worthwhile. The bag also had to be of very fine weave in order to prevent the hot air from escaping, or at least prevent it from escaping at too great a rate. Certain forms of experimental flora produced a sap that could either be extruded into long, very strong thread, or into sheets of soft fabric. Unfortunately, they'd been given up as too expensive to be worthwhile. Like so many other things, though, they were not economically viable at the moment. His household saved at least a few samples, just in case. Royan himself had done the spells that had brought several fields along from seed to adult in a matter of weeks, rather than months. People had been hired for the specific purpose of producing the thread and weaving it into closely woven fabric Royan needed. He took the small ebony box from its workshop shelf. The small polished cubical ebony box that would do all the necessary work. It held the mechanism that would blow hot air into the bag, augment the lifting power of the hot air, and provide propulsion as well. The power that worked the spells inside the box were stored within, in a device commonly used for lower level spells. The device had to be repowered from time to time, and was more wasteful of power than a spell charged with its own sacrifice. On the other hand, the power mechanism permitted a person to do a spell or spells for a long time, without the physical burden having to be borne for the same time. He spoke the words that started the mechanism filling the bag with air, then began storing supplies he had requisitioned inside the basket, attached by a network of ropes to the bag. Even so, he had to wait a little while longer for the bag to fully inflate to the point where it was straining to leap for the sky. He got into the basket and spoke the word that released the spells it had held to the ground. With gathering speed, he rose into the night sky. He had chosen the middle of the night for his expedition to begin, when most folk would be in bed, or at least indoors, and no one would immediately besiege Pangua household, demanding to know what sinister contraption they were letting loose now. Some people, such as astrologers, might catch sight of it in the sky, but were unlikely to be able to tell just where it had come from. Besides, in Royan's experience, astrologers were a notably unworldly lot, and their greatest concern would be whether this might be some new heavenly body that must be taken into account in their calculations. It grew colder as he rose, and it occurred to him that he knew mountain tops were cold, so he ought to have dressed properly. He drew a little powder from the ebony box in the corner to warm himself a bit. He dared not take too much. That would cause the warm air for the bag or the propulsion effect to fall off. The one that would have him falling closer to the ground sooner than he wanted. The other would make it difficult to fly either against or across the winds. At present, by judging the moon and the stars, he was traveling pretty much westward. He intended to correct his course from time to time, especially in the latter days of his journey, as the exact effects of the wind became known. The feeling of flight was elating, though flight in this manner was much more cumbrous than the swooping, swerving flights of birds. It occurred to him that this might be the salvation of the Pangua household. Merchants would pay well to have their cargo lifted and taken from one city to another, ignoring the winds and bends of the caravan roads. He would have to do something to maintain the Pangua house monopoly on the device as well, as long as possible. Possibly have people trained to use the devices, with each device key to a particular person. Even go so far as to arrange a set of spells to cause the device to burst destructively if tampered with. Any set of safeguards that could be imposed magically could eventually be unraveled magically, of course. But if Pangua House could continue to develop the notion, making constant improvements, by the time any of the other houses had put out their version, Pangua would be well established in the market. He smiled. Moving in a little advance of yourself, aren't you? The dark night air continued to flow by as he went along. He suddenly woke. His head was leaning in the on the rim of the woven wood basket. The cool air was still flowing past, and he was still flying west, but behind him the dawn was lightening the horizon. He tried to estimate how long he'd been asleep, then shook his head. No, he wasn't altogether recovered from the results of Tangrel's disaster yet. There was one thing to be said for the Grand Master, Royan thought. He could order the servants to prepare the supplies of this and that nature, and there was no one higher up for the servants to check with as to what he was actually authorized to requisition, whether he was actually authorized to requisition all this. He was thus well stocked with food, most of it the sort that could last several days. He picked up a loaf of bread and attempted to break it. Yes, his logical thinking was still impaired. When he tapped the power of the box to warm himself, it hadn't occurred to him to consider the effect of the continued cold on his food supplies. He took the small knife from his waist, pricked his thumb, and flicked away a drop of blood into the wind. Burning was the preferable means of sacrifice, but this casting away was enough to power a minor working. He repeated a formula, then touched the loaf of bread, a sausage, and almost as an afterthought, the skin of wine. He smiled at that. If he had done this sort of working in the presence of a client, he probably would have wasted such a touch of power on some kind of display. Flashing lights, colorful auras, or the like. Laypersons often needed that sort of thing to convince them that the magic had actually happened. He'd reckoned the thing fairly closely. The bread was thawed, but not hot. The sausage was cold in the middle. He was going to have to take note of everything he was learning on this trip. First of all, warm clothing, or at least robes or blankets to wrap the travelers in. About the food, well, they could work up some sort of chest to keep things from freezing. The wine was still cold. It had not been the best wine to start with, but the taste was now somewhat sort of appalling. He didn't think the freezing and thawing could account for the deterioration, so perhaps the actual magical spell he'd used had had unexpected effects. He grinned slightly. A little test to give some of the better students. See if they could devise a spell to warm wine without destroying the taste. A little working, a trivial amount of magic used, practically no possibility of the production of wild magic. The grin went away. For the foreseeable future, masters of Pangua House were going to go at each and every working with a strong concern for wild magic and shielding. On into the west he flew, with the rising sun at his back. This village, Strixbolg, is away west of the city, in what they call new lands, Morlai smiled. Not so much new as wild. People came here from further east, when the land back up there was starting to fill up. I see. Whoever, or whatever, had taught Allison the language, had neglected to fill in some gaps. She had no idea what Strick had been, nor what a bolg was. She didn't bother asking. It was something she could find out about later. And in the meantime, there were more important things she needed to know. Where's the outhouse? Follow the path round back. The outhouse stank. There was no nice word for it. On the other hand, Allison had done field work in some primitive conditions, so it was no shock for her, considering the rest of society. She wasn't sure if it was something that showed her expression or just moralized bias against the city, but the wise woman's immediate comment when Allison was returned was, "This isn't the city, where they take care of all the smells from their outhouses by magic." Allison considered for a moment, explaining flush toilets and sewage treatment plants, but decided this was another thing that she should just let go. Morlai's mood seemed to change almost immediately. She offered Allison a piece of flatbread and an earthenware cup. "Bread and chalberry wine for you, my guest." The last part sounded like a formula, and Allison, though she couldn't find in her own command of the language any answering formula, said, "Thank you," and took the bread first, then the wine. The bread could have had been cooked in a flat cake, much like a pita, and tasted as though the main ingredient were potatoes. The wine was red and sweet, with a hint of something like cranberry, but not quite. Sit, Allison. Morelai gestured toward one of the wooden stools next to a rough log table, which, from the look of it, was used more for preparing herbal remedies than dining. You know anything about medicine? Not a lot. I know something about the plants we use back home for medicine, but pretty well everything's different here. Morelai nodded. I see. Well, maybe we can start with that a little later. Suppose you just follow along with me and learn something about the village first. First of all, Samashak has some tangle in his boorish. I'd better go over and take care of that. Apparently whoever had brought her here had put terms for various crops and weeds in her head, so that she could see in her mind the boorish similar to the oat she knew back home, save that the leaves were each divided into 3 slender spheres, and the grain itself, when ripe, was either red, black, or yellow. Tangle was a blue-green with a thick stalk and a head that eventually ripened into a bright white flower, and still later scattered its seeds around for the next year. Samashak was a tall, skeletal man, very tanned, with hair beginning to go gray. He grinned when he saw them. A good day to you both. Allison reflected that her arrival must have been the talk of the town this morning. A good day to you as well, Samashak. This is my guest, Allison. Fine, fine. Will you deal with my tangle now? Yes, don't push, Samashak. Morelai looked at the field. Allison thought it only barely possible to distinguish what was tangle and what was boorish at this stage, and in some cases not even that distinction could be made. Was Morelai supposed to have some special knowledge that would allow her to decide which could be pulled up and which left behind? But Morelai didn't do anything of the sort. Instead, she took out a small knife that hung at her waist. A bronze knife, Allison thought, and pricked the ball of her thumb. She let a drop of blood fall on the earth, and then spoke a quick phrase that wasn't included in the language as Allison knew it. In fact, it seemed like another language altogether. Morelai paused for a moment, then said, There you are, my friend. They'll begin dying this evening, tomorrow morning at the latest. Good, good, Samashak's white teeth showed. I'll have one of my youngsters bring you over a loaf of Adami's bread this afternoon. Next time I go hunting, I'll remember you. Good, the crop looks quiet. Allison thought she might have misheard. Quiet didn't seem like a term to be applied to crops. But the old farmer answered, Quiet, yes. Now that was was that some kind of superstitious way of complimenting the crops so that the spirits or whatever wouldn't feel insulted and cause problems? Or was it some sort of dialectical thing that the teacher hadn't prepared Allison for? Morelai walked from here to there in the village, looking at the crops and giving a commentary on things that seemed to her to be interesting. Flahas. She indicated a small crop that appeared to have gotten an earlier start than Samashak's boorish. It looked like pea vines, even though now they were blue color. Allison's mind whispered "Wackles" at her, and gave her a vision of what looked like a much dark purple pea pod. Inside it would have something that looked like a purple kidney bean. What shocked her most of all was the potato. Everything about it said that it was what she knew as Solanum tuberosum. It was locally known as alum, with only a slight difference of vowels in the form that the teacher who brought her here had put into Allison's head. Moreover, what she knew about the alum was that, by all surface indications, it was a potato, complete with the edible tuberous roots. Furthermore, it was ground and made into flour, from which someone had baked that pita-like bread. So how had the potato gotten here? And furthermore, How had it gotten here sufficiently long ago to be so common? On the other hand, she was here. If she could have been brought here, couldn't someone bring a potato? Actually, it wasn't that simple. They'd have to bring enough to actually grow and produce enough of a crop to even begin to spread. But they were undeniably here and presented a puzzle. But it was a puzzle she didn't even have enough pieces of to attempt a solution. They visited a few houses, mostly houses where Lorelei had been treating people for this or that. Anything from coughs and colds to broken limbs. She met practically everyone in the village, though it would take her some time to remember all the names. Everyone was a bit wary of her. Some were unfriendly, which she read as the way they showed their wariness. After all, she was an outsider, and who knew what these city people might do? She also got a feeling that Morelei's acceptance went a long way towards gaining the villagers' tentative approval. She also met old Kangasa, the nearest thing to a headman the village possessed. His position was due to a combination of his years and a general reputation for wisdom. His hair turned white, and he carried a staff more to lean on than as a symbol of his office. He turned to Allison. "I see the wise woman has already made you welcome." "Yes, thank you." "Good. May no trouble attend your stay among us." It was said with a sense of formula, but as Allison got the feeling it was not just something the elder was expected to say. Like too many other things, her language teacher seemed to have left out any notion of how to respond. She said, "I'll try not to cause trouble," and noticed looks from both Kangasa and Morelai that suggested she was hardly fit to be in polite company. She almost burst out with, "I didn't ask to be sent here." She realized just in time that this would be put on par with complaining, "It's not fair." Instead, she held her peace. But Kangasa had other things on his mind than instructing strangers in proper protocol. He turned to Morelai. "They say Norvalik and his family are unhappy about the sharing of the crops." She nodded. Yusuyen had twins early this spring, when the stores were already low. He almost smiled at that one. "They are that way, aren't they? Always the first among the complainers, and sometimes if there's nothing to complain about, they'll find something. Maybe it's time someone told them to go find some village they'd be more comfortable at." Kangasa's face was unreadable. "Don't like that sort of thing. It always causes division, no matter how gently it's handled. I'll go soothe them, tell them they're being no harder done by than anyone else in the village." He was off on his way, and Morelai continued on her own way. Allison followed along. One of the next houses they visited was dominated by an old man in a bed. He said nothing, did nothing, but everyone appeared to be aware of his presence, and it seemed to be a presence that made them nervous. A woman, possibly a few years younger than Kangasa, looked up when Morelai came in. "Ah, Morelai. You still can't do anything for him, then?" Morelai shook her head. "I told you before, Antelga, there's nothing I can do. It's his time. Time for him to go dwell among the stars. But Gorodin is too strong. His body, his mind have given away, but his spirit still holds fast to this world. In his day he was a good man, a respected man, right. But now he lies like this," Antelga burst out. "I'd rather see him pass and go down to the stars, Morelai. This doesn't honor his memory." Morelai shook her head. "I do what I can to ease his passing, but I can't hurry it." And Helga sighed. "No, I suppose not. Will you eat with us?" "We ought not. We'd be a bother." No, you won't be a bother. I wouldn't have said it that my house be dishonored with the wise woman. I won't have it said that my house dishonored the wise woman." So they ate bread there, along with some sort of meat, which resembled turkey. It didn't seem polite to ask what the meat was, and it was offered with one of those dialectical words, "Rafiti," that her language teacher hadn't prepared her for. They wandered from place to place in the village, no seeming set of regular rounds, and some houses Morley didn't visit. Allison could only guess that it was because no one was sick in those houses. Some people were introduced by nicknames such as Knees, due to his knobby knees, or Hunter, or Little Fellow, who was tall and broad. One cheery man, Sathanki by name, was working in a field. After they'd passed him, Morley said, "You'll probably hear him called Holder, but not to his face. They call him that because anytime anyone wants to borrow his spear, or shovel, or hoe, or whatever, he almost always claims that he's just about to use it. Not enough that it's worth the disruption to ask him to find a village better suited to himself, but just enough to be aggravating." There was a large house in the approximate center of the village, which Morley pointed out as the Bath House. Bath House in the local language put into Allison's mind a large marble building, where men and women came to sit in the steam. This wooden building was clearly not that, but Allison had difficulty figuring out the questions to ask to clarify it, so she just asked, "How does it work?" Which of course got her a strange look from Morley. How does it work? Everybody takes part, seeing that wood is cut and supplied, seeing that water is brought. How else? How does it work in the city? "I'm not from the city. I'm from somewhere else altogether. Where I come from, water is supplied by the city for a charge, and for another charge they supply the gas," wasn't in the local vocabulary, "stuff burned to heat it. When you want a bath, you turn on the mechanism that allows the water to flow into the tub. Tub required circumlocution. Large, low container. Then you lie in the water and wash." Morley stared at her. "Now that's a strange way of doing things. Here we use steam. We heat up rocks and pour water on them, and everyone gets in to get clean." "Everybody?" "Well, not everybody at once, of course. The building only holds so many. It usually goes by family, but there's usually room for one or two more any night." A suspicion crept over Allison. Men and women together? This got her another look. "Of course. I can't." Morley gave her a stern look. The cure administering a bad taste medicine to a child. "Girl, so long as you're a guest in my house, you'll stay clean, or do you want to move out to the barns?" Allison said no more about it. They went past Samashak's field later on that day, and Allison saw that some of the weeds were beginning to droop. "Magic," she thought to herself. "Someone brought me here somehow. Something the locals call magic because they don't understand it. But this, even I don't understand this." Some boys carrying long sticks were apparently in charge of some animals who were foraging in and around the surrounding forests. The animals were about 4 feet tall, hornless, with a hoof divided in 3. It was recognized by the language teacher as a daja, daja, used for milking and occasionally meat and leather. There was a smaller sort of animal, usually wandering in more closely bunched herds, known as Raxler. They had 2-part hooves. Though the females were milked, the main purpose of the Raxler was to be sheared for its wool. There were birds around as well, which seemed to be semi-domesticated. They have the general shape of cassowary, though Allison seemed to admitted to little knowledge of birds, though they are slightly smaller than the cassowary as well. Their local name was sortigut, but the language teacher didn't seem to know them. "Are they wild?" she asked, feeling foolish for having to ask. But Morley chuckled. "Oh yes, they gather around because of the bits and scraps of food they pick up. These ones have taken to nesting right near the village. They have to be kept out of the fields, particularly right after sowing, or they'll eat the crops before they had a chance to sprout." "You don't magic them away?" Morley's look told her she'd just asked a stupid question. Why on earth would I do that? They're so willing to hang around and be ready for the eating. Chasing them off would be foolishness, so long as they don't kill too many at one time, so they don't get the notion that this is dangerous territory. They'll keep coming around. Another bit of food when the crops are low. That night Morley said, "Come along, we're going to the bathhouse." "I can't undress in front of all those people." "Why not? They'll be undressing in front of you." "Because," she couldn't force herself to explain. "So," she looked at her closely, "this deep trouble, it still holds you?" Allison glared at her. "You're telling me to get over it?" Morley shrugged. "Stop letting it rule your life, for sure." "Stop letting it rule? You don't know what you're talking about." "No exact words, no. But you go around with every muscle in your body shouting, 'I carry the weight of the world wherever I go.' Hard to miss. Only thing I can say is, I can't fix it. No one can fix it. You've got two ways to go. Be the broken bird all your life, or take charge of your life and deal with it on your own terms." As psychotherapy went, it was terrible. Psychotherapy was supposed to be non-directive, to help the person see the way to deal with the problem for themselves. As advice, it was even worse. "Seems so easy the way you say it." The wise woman shrugged. "Most of life's not easy. We all of us have our troubles and our burdens. Seems to me the thing to do is to see just how much of the burden you really need to carry all your life. For now, though, come along to the bathhouse." Morley kept a light hand on Allison's arm all the way, and Allison had a feeling that if she tried to get away, that hand would take a firm hold. Morley opened the bathhouse and stepped into a cloud of steam. The place smelt of hot water and soap. It was worse than Allison had expected. Not only was all of the clothing taken off at the door, but the talk was all ribald joking. The sort of talk that went on here was known as bathhouse talk, and was recognized as not fit for other occasions. Even though the main part of her mind accepted that this talk meant nothing to the local people, whatever had brought her here hadn't adjusted her to the notions of what was right. It was one of the hardest things she'd done. Allison decided, though she picked a dim corner to sit in by herself, staring at her toes most of the time, she felt as if all eyes were on her. Though a few times she looked up, no one seemed to be casting more than a glance in her direction. Some plants that were considered weeds when among the farmers' crops were actually good for medicines. Just as boys back home grew up learning to distinguish the makes and models of cars, so children here knew every plant in their world at each stage in its growth. The medicinal ones they would bring to Morley, with a ball of earth around the roots, and she would set them into small plants and encourage them to grow. Very few of them refused to do so. "I am chief curer of the village, mostly because I got a bit of plant magic as well. A lot of people have some plant magic, but some jobs need a bit more than that. As for the curer business, most families have a list of medicines and remedies that get passed down along the family, and they're usually willing to share them. I pick up a few others from time to time, brought by visitors from other villages, or by merchants passing through. I have a bit of good luck with my remedies, too." "You mean you use magic with them?" Morley chuckled. "Only magic I've got's a bit of skill with making things grow or not. Don't really do spells with my herbs, but people seem to get better with them. Placebo effect. The words are necessarily in English." Morley's brow furrowed. "What's that?" "It doesn't translate exactly. What it is that doctors back home have discovered that people will improve even if the pill they're being given is nothing more than sugar. That means that when they test medicines to see if they have an effect, they always have one group taking a sugar pill instead. Yeah, and even the researchers don't know which person is getting what. To be considered a proper medicine, the drug has to be more effective than the sugar pill. I'm making the process seem more simple than it actually is, but that's roughly it. Morley nodded. Curers have a saying. We don't cure people, we just make it easier for the body to cure itself. The village was small enough that Allison came to meet all the three men who had met her in the forest the first day. Darrow, the leader of the trio, was generally friendly, and Flan would give her a friendly wave and a smile as well. She was still sure she didn't want to be anywhere alone with Flan, though she couldn't exactly trust that feeling, knowing how much of it was colored by the events of that first day. She fell into the position of assistant curer to the village. She also discovered she had a nickname, Corner Girl, from her habitual position in the bathhouse. It wasn't her favorite nickname, but she had to admit she had been called worse. She came to be on good terms with old Kangasa, learning what his job was by listening and watching what went on in the village. His authority over the people was based on consensus and was not used to enrich himself, or have people work for him. He was recognized as a good elder in his time, only because in his time only two families had chosen to go somewhere else rather than agree to one of his occasional suggestions. Furthermore, he had managed to mediate disputes between people between families without leaving a permanent rift in the village. On the other hand, Morley warned Allison of two families. Be careful of mentioning any one family in the other's hearing. They're still a little sensitive from the matter of the Raxler 3 years back. Allison wanted to ask further about that, but she was still too new in the village, and didn't think it was her place to be nosing out all the gossip. People are people, though, and the people of Strixbolg were no exceptions. Quarrels happened, often over little things, and sometimes even came to blows. Allison was present at one such situation. Morley had said, "Take a dose of this painkiller up to Orfolo. He's having trouble from the gash he gave himself with the hoe yesterday." She was just coming up to Orfolo's garden when she saw Orfolo stand up and swing a fist into Campbell's face. Campbell went down, surprise on his face, then came back up roaring. "You blasted slasher, I'll show you!" Allison stopped still, but suddenly people were all around the pair, pulling them apart and standing between them when they attempted to get at each other. There was a lot of shouting around people trying to calm the participants, and Allison got the gist of the affair. Campbell had been badgering Orfolo, calling him Slasher, and every time Orfolo made a move, he'd been hoeing his potatoes, and saying such things as, "Oop! Count your toes, Slasher? Still got those fingers?" Finally, Orfolo had had enough, which had been about the time of Allison's arrival. Old Kangasa had come, at as much of a rush as his old bones would allow, and took the situation in, then began talking. Allison knew that in most circumstances he would not make a decision immediately, claiming he needed a night to think. The next day, in front of as much of the village as cared to gather, he would lead the men through a long rambling discourse on how much they each meant to each other, and what it meant for the village to divide against itself. This time, though, he didn't give himself the night to think, but launched into his oration immediately. At appropriate parts of the speech, various people would at least nod, or perhaps even going so far as to say, "Yes, yes." The local equivalent of, "You preach, Reverend," Allison thought to herself. At last the two men themselves began to nod their own agreement. Finally, the elder asked the important question, "Will you stay as friends, then, or will you leave the village?" Campbell muttered, "I will stay," followed by a moment later Orfolo's grumble of assent. "Good," Kangasa said, giving each of them a measuring look. "Let it be so." That was usually the end of such a dispute, and no more was said. People went back to their business. Campbell moved off a little from Orfolo, and found a task to busy himself with. Allison delivered moralized medicine and noticed that Orfolo was still tense. It would be a while, she figured, before those two would be at ease in each other's company. There were no clocks or calendars in the village, though there were limits set by the season as to when the plowing and planting had to be done. As an assistant curer, though, Allison's duties were a bit fuzzy, and so long as she was not too far away when Morley wanted her, all was well. So she took her time heading back, studying various plant life, occasionally trying to compare it to something similar back home. Of course, even back home there were plants she didn't know, or didn't know at all well. Someone was always discovering some new thing in the jungles of Papua New Guinea or in the Amazon. She heard a movement behind her, and saw Orfolo striding out of his house with a spear in his hand. At first, her first thought was that it was a bit late in the day for hunting. Then she realized he was striding toward Campbell. By the time she recovered enough from her stunned shock to yell, Orfolo had rammed his spear through Campbell's chest. Death was almost instantaneous. There was no question of a wild, unaimed blow. Orfolo had aimed for the heart, and hit it. Then the shouting started anew. This time, though, while Campbell's relatives had tried to get at Orfolo, who was standing there, stunned at what he'd done, Orfolo's relatives were around him, protecting their kinsman. Spears were coming up now, and axes, and though no one did more than a tentative jab or feigned strike. Other people, less closely related, tried to come between the two parties. They carried no arms so as not to inflame the things more, being concerned for the good of the village. Kangasa was fetched again, and he came huffing and puffing with haste. He surveyed the scene, and the grief was clear on his face. "Ha! Bad thing, this!" He looked at Orfolo for a long while. "Orfolo, you must go from the village. If you wish, you may come back when the moon has waned and become full again, and see if there is a place for you." Campbell's family were not satisfied. "No! Blood for our blood! Blood for our blood!" Kangasa turned a severe look on them. "Blood for our blood, you say? And next Orfolo's family will shout blood for our blood, and the village will drown itself in a never-ending river of blood. No, Orfolo will leave here, and any who hinders him must first strike me. Am I heard?" There was a dull muttering from some quarters, but Kangasa escorted Orfolo to his house, where he collected an axe, a spear, and a bag of food. Orfolo was not yet married, so there was no wife or family to accompany him. Kangasa saw him off to the edge of the forest, then returned. "Tomorrow we must hold a spirit feast, to lift the spirit of the murder from the village." When Allison got back home, she asked Morley, "Has Kangasa got enough authority that they'll just let Orfolo go like that?" "He has as much authority as people will allow him. Orfolo had better go far and fast and stay hidden. Campbell's brothers will likely be after him before sundown." "You mean?" "Sometimes the slayer would go off, and perhaps come back at the appointed time. He may even find a place in the village. But there are some cases, such as this one, when there is too much anger." "What about Orfolo's brothers? Will they go to help Orfolo?" "Probably not fight alongside him. More likely just go out and try to mess up his trail. Make it harder for anyone to follow Orfolo. Even that could lead to trouble out there in the bush. It could still destroy the whole village." Allison remained silent. The next evening actually, there was a large communal feast, at which attendance was as near to compulsory as could be managed in a society where compulsion was an abhorrent. Kangasa spoke with a great deal of fervor, much of his speech being in the form of a prayer to the supreme deity, Sanat, asking that Sanat would lift the spirit of the murder from Strix's bulk. He also spoke to the people. "We are much greater together than we are apart, and dividing into factions will destroy the village, as surely as if you set the buildings afire, killed the livestock, and plowed up the growing crops." The speech was accompanied by a lot of mumbling from the crowd, and though most seemed to agree with the elder, other voices were murmuring less peaceably. The Dachsa, the Dajatha had been killed for the feast, and some of the store for potatoes, despite her knowledge of the local language. Allison found it hard to think of them as anything less than baked as anything else, were baked as well. Sufficient bread was available also, each household having supplied a loaf or two. Campbell's close relations contributed to the feast. Apparently they were able to see to it that it was for the good of the village, though it kept them off the murderer's trail for an extra day. Later that evening Allison asked Morelei, "Do you think it helped?" Helped? Yes, for sure. If only that some people were actually able to do some thinking before they went off chasing after a killer. It means that a lot of people are at least thinking about the good of all above their need for vengeance, or their need to protect their relatives. She was quiet for a moment. The next few days will tell the tale. If we see too many hunting parties going out, we may be in trouble yet. Allison was left to consider the problems of administering justice in a small, isolated village. Who made laws? Well, apparently the king issued edicts, most to do with taxation. But how was justice, whatever you called it, locally administered and enforced? The most serious crime, murder, which they'd just seen, involved not just the killer and his victim, but the families of each. Just as back home, any murder almost always brought the family of the victim to demand justice, so it was here. The difference was that here, all that kept the village from seeking vengeance was whatever moral suasion the village and the elder could bring to bear. Custom frowned on seeking eye for an eye. It was recognized as harmful and divisive. However, there was no force locally to prevent people from seeking vengeance. The notion of jails was ridiculous. The village couldn't spare people to guard the jail, let alone feed someone who couldn't contribute to the welfare of the village. Capital punishment? That left the family of the executed murderer with a grudge against whoever had passed the sentence, as well as whoever had carried it out. She shook her head. The village was run by rules and customs that had developed over years, likely centuries and more, and the situation was so far different from anything she knew that no suggestion she could think up would fit the state of affairs. Besides that, it was very difficult to change a traditional society overnight, and no one would ever thank her for trying. Well then, so that's the end of this chapter. Like I said, they're much longer. This one has to get redone. There's going to be a lot of heavy editing in this. I already know this. Yeah, but I will talk to you all again very soon. Even tomorrow night. And so have a good night, and I will talk to you again. Thank you.